Welcome to the Amy Noel YouTube channel. Today I have Hilary Laxon with me again, and she's going to be sharing a phenomenal story about how she helped her daughter and her experience with raising a daughter with dyslexia. Tell me, you live in Georgia, correct? In the United States?
Yeah, I'm in middle Georgia, which is like it sounds, the middle of Georgia.
When did you first learn that your daughter has dyslexia?
I knew something was wrong when she was probably 3 or 4. At the time, I knew my ex-husband was dyslexic, but I didn't really comprehend what that meant, which is crazy because my dad was a doctor and my grandfather was a psychiatrist and my mom was a nurse. And so I don't think any of us understood the gravity of what that word meant, even, because a lot of medical people actually don't get any training in dyslexia. I started hiring private tutors for her when she was 3 or 4. I had her at a preschool in Hawaii. I had somebody working with her every day after school. In hindsight, I made the mistake that a lot of parents make, which was that I hired tutors that knew nothing about dyslexia. They knew nothing about Orton-Gillingham. And so for like 4 years, I had tutors working with her. In hindsight, what the signs of what she had going on were things like she couldn't tie her shoes. She didn't know which hand was left and right. She couldn't write her name out. She couldn't do basic math. A lot of things like that are key warning signs that people talk about now, she did. And then it was probably she was 6 when I finally took her to, we have TRICARE insurance because my ex-husband's active duty still. So I took her to primary care and they sent me to a child psychologist, which was also a big mistake. And at that time, they thought she was only ADHD and attentive, as well as having an auditory processing disorder.
Can I interrupt the question?
Yeah, sure.
So you said you got a tutor for her when she was 3 and 4 years old?
She couldn't write letters. She couldn't say the letters or draw them out or anything.
But at that point, you didn't know she was dyslexic yet?
No, I didn't put the 2 and 2 together because, like I said, we didn't really comprehend how severe her case was, and we didn't really comprehend what the word dyslexia meant.
Why was child psychologist a mistake?
Well, what I come to find out now is that a child psychologist in general does not see a lot of kids that are dyslexic or have any neurodiversity issues. And so you're better off going to see a neuropsychologist, hence the word neuro, meaning brain or things to do with the brain, which is what dyslexia is. There are people who are child psychologists who might see a fair amount of dyslexia cases if you're in a major US area, but not necessarily. And if it was me, that would be my message to a lot of people who have younger kids, to find the money to send your kid to a neuropsychologist at least once and figure out what's going on. So yeah, I took her, the first person she saw was a child psychologist because P.S., even 8 years later, TRICARE doesn't cover a neuropsychology evaluation and they cost somewhere between $2,500 to $5,000. You might find a university that has PhD candidates or PhD students who do it at a different discounted rate, but even those people, one, you're going to wait a long time, like 6 months, a year is not uncommon. And even still, those people get somewhere around $500 to $1,000, depending on where you are. She wasn't actually diagnosed as being dyslexic till 8, but at that point, I had already had a Wilson-trained Orton-Gillingham tutor for 2 years, because at that point, we were under the impression that she probably was, but we didn't need the test.
When did you get a neuropsychologist evaluation?
She was probably 8 or 9 the first time I had one.
Tell me about her other comorbid diagnoses.
We didn't realize the extent of things she had going on. So if I had had a neuropsychologist evaluate her sooner, I would have known about a lot of these other things. She, as of today, has severe dyslexia. There's 4 categories of dyslexia, or that's what people believe. So she's the 3rd worst kind out of 4. She also has ADHD and attentive, and then she has an auditory processing disorder. And then in May of 2019, which is just a year ago, mind you, 7 years after I started this whole fiasco, we found out she was also had a mild to moderate receptive expressive language disorder, as well as a temporal processing disorder. And it turned out that the temporal processing disorder was actually harming her more than the auditory processing disorder. because of what it, was doing to how she processed stuff in her brain.
How did you find out about those two things last year?
She somehow made it from 3rd grade until about 7th grade before people started saying, like, I don't get it. She had accommodations of, a Kindle book with the Audible. She had a Chromebook with all kinds of technology on it, but people couldn't figure out why she would read even one chapter, and she had a very hard time telling you what the chapter was about. And that's usually when somebody says, well, maybe it's an intelligence issue, right? But at that point, I had multiple reports from the neuropsychologist telling me my kid had above average intelligence. And then what happened is my tutor said, I think you need to go back to the neuropsychologist and figure out what's going on because she can't comprehend reading. That's what she said to me. So most people in the education world will tell you that there's a equation, like math, about how you comprehend reading. So we started to pick it apart, right? Because I went back to knowing what I knew being around medical my entire childhood. And I said, well, let's see if she can see. Well, it turned out she needed glasses, but she was only 20/40, so that wasn't causing the problem. And so then I drug her back to an ENT, and I had them test her, and they said, nope, her hearing is above average for somebody her age. And I was like, what? So then they sent me to an audiologist within the ears, nose, and throat specialist, and they tested her. And mind you, we already knew she had the auditory processing disorder between when she was diagnosed at age 6, and this is now she's 13. As far as we all know, it's not really hampering her ability to learn, or we thought it wasn't. Turns out they do all the new testing in a soundproof booth over hours, and they find out she's poor or below average in every single category of the auditory testing. Then that person sent me to a speech language pathologist, who I was already going to anyway, because I was like, well, I'm going to, there's got to be something else to this besides you can't hear, you're not processing auditory sound. And so we went to a speech language pathologist, and they give her all the testing. And again, both of these I've done using TRICARE because I know if I use the medical system, I get care in 6 weeks or 2 months, right? And if I use the school system, it might be 6 months before I get anything at all. And the speech language pathologist does all the testing and says that she's below or poor average on every single category of language. And she's in 7th grade. So this kid is somehow, what I've been told is that she's so smart that she's figured out a way to compensate all the way through with all this. Her language ability, it presents like random gaps of language. So you'd be talking to your kids like you do normally, and you'll say some word. Philosophy, that was one that got her stumped up. That's not a big word. It's not an uncommon word. It's used all the time. She didn't know what that word meant. She had never heard of it. And she was missing all these random words with no apparent pattern. And that was part of her problem because people would say these words and she didn't know what they meant.
You found out this information from a speech pathologist and an audiologist, not a neuropsychologist.
Correct.
What other specialists do people need to go see for their children? What else is out there?
If you're talking about dyslexia, it's not uncommon for there to be an audiologist involved, a speech language person involved, an occupational therapy. Like some of that stuff she did when she was younger with, the penmanship and not being able to hold the pen and stuff like that. Some of those kids have such extreme cases of occupational therapy that they actually need physical therapy. Like maybe their motor skills aren't that great. It just depends. All these kids are different and the spheres that go off of them are never the same.
You did tutoring and all of those tests for your daughter. What did the school do to help your daughter?
So I've actually learned a lot more about this stuff in the last 2 years because of what I've had to learn to try to figure out what the heck was going on with my child. So I didn't get a whole lot from the school. Like when she was 5, same story. We're in kindergarten, and it wasn't soon after kindergarten somebody says, oh, I'll put her in small group. It's very misleading when they tell you this because you think, oh, small group, right? Oh, that sounds great. And you're like, okay, great. Bobby's going to get help now. He's in small group. And then in fact, if you're dyslexic and they put you in small group, unless it uses Orton-Gillingham or multisensory, it's not going to do your kid any good. And that's what happened to her. So then at that point, I still had a private tutor after school, but P.S. I didn't know to use Orton-Gillingham. So the person I had, even though they were a certified special ed teacher in California, I just wasn't having a lot of luck with her making progress and being able to read very well for her age. So I had IEP meetings, but unfortunately, I'm like a lot of people who think that the hurdle is getting the IEP meeting, right?
When did she get an IEP?
She got one for other health impairment, for the ADHD, and for the auditory processing disorder when she was 6. But my IEP, it didn't have a lot of services in it. It did not have one-on-one reading. It didn't have specialized instruction. It did not have a co-taught classroom.
At what point did you realize you needed to change all of those services? Was that just 2 years ago?
No, so I knew about a charter school in San Diego that was using some components of Orton-Gillingham. We had a neighbor who was a teacher in Chicago who knew a heck of a lot about elementary education, and she got her 3 kids into the school. And so every year I kept applying to get in this lottery, and I finally got a spot for my child in 4th grade. So before 4th grade, I was substituting everything with private instruction. And then we moved to the new charter school, and we started getting Linda Bell at school. But even then, my IEP was not as good as it is now.
Tell me about how you got to where you are now.
I got to where I am now with that whole sentence of your child doesn't comprehend reading. So we moved to Georgia in December of 2018. My ex-husband's active duty, and he's still stationed in southern Georgia. And when I got here, my first IEP meeting wasn't really an IEP meeting. I don't think they had any idea what they were doing or dealing with. There were like 2 people in it, maybe 3. And so after the first meeting, I called another meeting. And my second meeting, there were like 6 people in there. And it was all her teachers and LEA person from the district. I don't know. I don't remember what they call them in California, but it was the local educational authority person for the state. And at that point, they basically accepted my IEP the way it was. But it became pretty obvious then that I kept asking stuff at school to the teachers and the principal, like, well, what do you do with your other dyslexic kids? Well, where are all the kids that are dyslexic that have, assistive technology? Like, where is that? And nobody knew anything about that stuff at my school, or that's what they were telling me. And so at that point, I started calling the district. And I said, I have this dyslexic student here. It doesn't seem like people have enough training. They don't seem to know what to do with her. My child has used a Chromebook for the last 4 years. We need an assistive technology evaluation because we cannot do work on paper all day with our dyslexia and our executive function issues. And so I got an AT evaluation.
I have a question. When you said you called the district, did you call the superintendent of the district or the special education directors? Who did you call?
Oh, I went straight to the superintendent because that's me. I called up there, not necessarily because I wanted them to get involved. I just didn't understand who I should be talking to. They told me who I needed to talk to, which was this person called the program specialist. So I don't know how California is, but Georgia, there's this director of student services at the top, right? And they report to an assistant superintendent, and then the person under that is these people called program specialists, and then the program specialists are over the caseworkers, and there's a caseworker for every grade in every school. So the program specialist was the person over the caseworker at the district. So then I called her.
Now,
she was kind of, what?
Let me explain to those watching. A caseworker is the person in charge of your child's IEP at the school. And then the program specialist is the person in the district over the case manager.
Right. So the caseworker is basically like the person whose really sole job is to implement every IEP in the school. So some of these caseworkers, unfortunately, have 50, 60 kids they're supposed to be in charge of. And that sucks for them, but that's not my problem, and it's not the kids' problem. And so I got this person involved, and we had another IEP meeting. So at this point, I'm up to my 3rd IEP meeting in like 4 months. And at that point, I got more services. I got an iPad at school. We started putting things on electronically. but they were still having a lot of trouble getting it implemented because they'd never had to do it. I believe it was about April of 2019, so I'd been here 4 months when my tutor said that she didn't comprehend reading. So I wrote another parent concern letter to the school saying that it had been brought to my attention by my private tutor that they believe my child had trouble comprehending reading. And I was wanting to request another IEP meeting to discuss her reading. So I went to an IEP meeting in May of 2019. And at that point, I had the private report from a speech language pathologist, and I had a private report from the audiologist, which I carried into them. And they were given ahead of time. And of course, they didn't really have any legs to stand on because the reports were so bad and they had nothing to contradict it. So then they had to start their own evaluation for those particular kinds of service to make sure that she didn't need some other sort of special ed service. And so during that meeting, all they agreed to do was to do the evaluation for speech language pathology and for audiology. Instead of just taking the tests I had from somebody who was apparently good enough to get paid by TRICARE. And so the last thing I requested at that IEP meeting was for reading support. And they said to me, this is when they said the famous thing to me, they said, "We don't support reading in middle school." And I sat there dumbfounded, like, "Excuse me, you don't support reading in middle school?" And I said, "What do you mean by that?" And they're like, "Well, we can't accommodate it in the schedule." And I'm like, thinking, okay, that's not my problem. And then they said they couldn't give reading support because they didn't get Title I funds. And just for everybody to know, Title I funds have nothing to do with IEPs. And it was pretty obvious that I was going to have to cable that and go back and hire an advocate and find someone else to fight them because I knew they were wrong. I just couldn't prove it at that point why they were wrong. I called an advocate that another mom in this area told me about who had dyslexic kids. We wrote another parent concern letter. So we had another IEP meeting in July. And this time the director of student services for this whole county came to my IEP meeting. Not only did she come, all 3 principals at my middle school came. The ingoing and outgoing caseworker came. An audiologist came. A speech language person came. The school psychologist came. Every single teacher I'd had the year before came, and every single teacher or one representing an incoming teacher was at my meeting. So there's only like 30 or 40 people at this meeting. Not big enough that it was in the library. That's how big this IEP meeting. And so it was my advocate and myself and my now husband were at this meeting. And it was entertaining, let me tell you. Because at this point, it's now July of 2019, right? And in May of 2019, Georgia passed the Dyslexia Law. And so at that point, they were setting off a series of actions that were going to happen over the next 5 years. But they had to make some sort of attempt to move towards progress. We sat at this IEP meeting, and it was funny because my advocate actually has a kid who's profoundly dyslexic, but is also twice exceptional. And so they would say stuff, and I just sat there and watched my advocate go after him because they didn't have the data or the information to fight anything she said. And so we walked out of there with Orton-Gillingham training, one-on-one in middle school, and the district's person was driving to the middle school to give the service because there was nobody else trained to provide the service in the whole county at this point.
An employee of the district will drive to the school to work with your daughter?
Yeah, they had to because the federal law says that if you have a deficit that requires you to have an IEP, that they're required to provide services if there's a need until the child turns 21. So if my child is still in high school and can't read on grade level and needs support in order to be able to do the material because of their reading issue, they have to support it, whether they've had to do it before or not in the past. And that's a big lesson for parents because you will hear all kinds of people tell you various things that sound like, we don't do that here, we can't afford that, we don't support that, you're going to have to give up lunch if you want that, or something crazy like that. And none of those things are true.
What time does your daughter get that one-to-one work? Is it during class time?
Because my child is ADHD, I refuse to give up lunch, and I refuse to give up PE. And I had letters from a psychologist saying that she, of all people, needed to be able to talk to her friends at lunch, and to do PE so that she would be able to focus during the day.
Mm-hmm.
So they ended up pulling her during art part of the time and then out of a different class, like not a major subject, a smaller subject.
Uh-huh.
And I fought for that because they wanted to provide it during lunch or during recess or something like that. And I was not going to have that. Like I had articles ready to go from all kinds of people telling you not to pull kids from recess or lunch for services. So I walked out of a meeting with 2 hours a week of Orton-Gillingham one-on-one. And then I walked out of there with speech language pathology, RTI. Because at this point, what's common with speech language pathology in general is that we miss a lot of kids that have language difficulties. We'll catch the kids that stutter. We'll catch the kids that don't speak. But they miss the kids who have language disorder, usually because they can compensate or because it's just not as obvious unless you start paying attention. We started 8th grade, because we're now almost at the end of 8th grade. So we still have the one-on-one reading. We still have the speech language. We're in tier 3 at this point for speech language. That's due to the language component and the lack of vocabulary that's causing issues in other classes. But we also still have private tutoring. So mind you, I'm still paying for private tutoring. I've had a private tutor now for 7 years, 3 times a week.
Wow.
That I'm tracking. And then I also have speech language services from TRICARE once a week.
What program is the school using for Orton-Gillingham, and what program is your tutor using?
We last summer switched to Barton from Wilson. So at this point I've had like 9 months of Barton, I guess. And then I've had the years before of Wilson. And in December, my neuropsychologist told me to keep going with the Barton. And then the school is also using multisensory, but they're explicitly working on fluency. So what happened is they got my advocate together along with my private tutor, and they said, we all need to get on the same page and figure out a plan so that we're not working against each other. So the school's only working on fluency, and then the other side is doing whatever else they want to do.
Oh, that's great. Can you explain to me what RTI is?
RTI is response to interventions. It's part of the steps of request for an evaluation for special ed. Sometimes your kid gets put in RTI and you don't even know about it as a parent. Like they will send you a letter and it sounds something like, we're going to evaluate and test your kid for something. And normally a lot of parents just sign it and send it in, and they have no idea that means they put their kid in RTI. So you can have RTI for reading, you can have RTI for math, you can have it for language. The federal law says you're only supposed to be in RTI about 12 weeks to 16 weeks before they're supposed to do a full evaluation for special ed services.
When she's getting RTI for speech, what are they doing with her?
My private person is working on only multi-meaning words. You know, I'm trying to think.
Homophones?
Yeah. And then the school is basically working on whatever language or vocab words would be in the curriculum for that grade. And so we tend to have a lot of trouble with science and social studies because of the words. So when you originally go to get an IEP, right, and you get all your testing and you end up with the IEP table, there's sometimes more than one reason that you qualify for an IEP, which is the word eligibility. So with dyslexics, the eligibility is usually under specific learning disability in reading, writing, or math, right? Well, specific learning disability happens to be the most difficult qualification to get an IEP on out of the other 13 options. It's easier to qualify somebody who's dyslexic and ADHD under other health impairment for the ADHD and then build the whole IEP, because once you, quote, qualify for an IEP and you're eligible, I can put whatever kind of services on there as long as I can get the IEP team to agree that they are impacting the education, right? So if I'm dyslexic and speech language pathology is not something that's typical as a dyslexic remediation or intervention, if I can prove that it's affecting the education, then they have to add that other service. So in my child's case, they were fighting about whether she was eligible for services. And we kept saying, it doesn't matter if she's eligible for services. because she already has an IEP with so many disabilities and diagnoses on it that it's pretty easy to prove why she needs the other service. But that was a fight we left for whatever, because I ended up getting them what I wanted them to do without calling it a service. So it stayed as RTI.
The biggest chunk of people who qualify for special education qualify under a specific learning disability. It's like 40% in California of the people who have special education qualified as SLD.
That's how it is here. It's like 37.4%. And then of those 37%, like 30-ish percent of the 30 are dyslexic. But I believe that a large portion of those are undiagnosed dyslexics because people don't go to neuropsychologists and there's not access to that stuff at school. So you get labeled specific learning disability and you don't necessarily get, Orton-Gillingham or multisensory remediation for your actual issue, which is dyslexia.
Even in my case, I've never taken my child to a neuropsychologist, any of them, because it's so expensive. So we know they're dyslexic, but we don't have the diagnosis, and the schools don't offer Orton-Gillingham based programs in general. How do you talk to your daughter about her diagnoses?
I grew up in a family full of doctors and nurses, and we were all very direct to the point about what it is. I just called it what it was, and I kept walking. Because we threw around a lot of other words like that in my family in normal conversation, and so we weren't going to make a big deal about it because it's like having, diabetes. Well, you're just diabetic and you have to have insulin. Like, that's it, With her, she has always known she's dyslexic. She actually can regurgitate my spiel I say about her. She doesn't care. She doesn't worry about it. She doesn't care if other people think she has it or don't think she has it. She does not care.
So is she open with her friends or her classmates? Does she say, I'm dyslexic?
She does, and it's funny because as she's gotten older, especially when we got to Georgia, people have said to her, that's where you switch letters. And she goes, no, that's a myth. It's a processing disorder.
What are your daughter's dyslexic gifts?
I'll answer that by telling you a story. So there's this meme on Facebook, and it's probably on the internet somewhere. It's a problem, one of those brain buster things, right? It's like a thing written out, right? And it says, write 5 words you can spell. And they gave this to like 100 kids to see what they would do when they wrote back. Well, my kid did what most dyslexics do. She wrote, write 5 words I can spell. They see the big picture, not the small picture. And so most people sat there and thought of dog, cat, house, whatever they thought of. And the dyslexics normally see something outside the box, right? The rules didn't say you couldn't use those words. She's super creative. She loves to be outside. She has a strange memory where she remembers bottomless, useless information, but has trouble with memory that she has to use immediately. The other day we were at a park walking along, right, and there's these signs that say snakes. I've actually only seen 2 snakes since I moved to Georgia. So we're walking along and she goes, look, it's a cottonmouth snake. And for people who don't know, a cottonmouth snake is, or a water moccasin is probably one of the most aggressive and poisonous snakes in the country. And so she's like, no, it's a cottonmouth. And so we're on this walking platform, right? And she can see it down there. And I'm like, well, why do you know that it's a cottonmouth? Well, because it has a pointy head and I don't even remember what she said. It was like a definition of what a cottonmouth's characteristics were out of the book. I've never bought this kid a snake book. And so she does that kind of stuff all the time. She did it with owls. She is very, very smart. She's caring. She loves playing outside. She will do anything for people who are her friends. She's very ingenious in that she remembers or figures out how to do stuff out of nowhere. She can research something like, I don't know any other 13-year-old who researches the way this kid researches things.
For you as a mom, what have you learned from this experience? How has raising a dyslexic child been a blessing to you?
Well, with her, because her frustration tolerance is very high, meaning she's frustrated by whatever, usually with no warning. I was never really a super patient person. I could control my patience, in front of people. Like I would never be in a store and like blow up with somebody. I wasn't that kind of impatient person, but I was not patient in anything I did. And this has made me very patient, because with my child in particular, if you correct her at all, you raise your voice at her at all, she retreats, like full on retreat in her room, not talking to anyone. And so I have learned, which is very difficult, I'm sure you can imagine as a mom, to never, ever scream at my child, like ever. And that is very hard to learn to do. I've learned to actually sit there and turn around and just walk away. You feel bad because when she was a lot younger, she was like 7 or 8, and that was when we had just started with the Orton-Gillingham person. She was frustrated a lot and was crying and throwing these tantrums. And even then I was like, I can't figure out like what just happened, and now I understand.
As a parent, right?
Yeah. And now I've learned from talking to other people who have dyslexic kids that that's not uncommon. So if you're one of these parents whose kid is frustrated all the time and people are telling you that there's nothing wrong with your child and you believe that there is something wrong with your child, you should trust your gut instinct, as they say, and take them to, other people and try to figure out what's wrong with them, or read books and articles and try to figure it out. Because I can promise you that any kid that's in your house that is frustrated and having tantrums like this on a regular basis, there's something wrong. And you've got to figure out what it is. If you think that your kid is having trouble reading and you're not getting help at school, I beg you to go find someone else to test them, whether that's somebody at a university, or maybe you have to use your credit card to pay for this person and pay it off. But I can promise you that if you don't find somebody to tell you, what the diagnosis is, it's going to lead to other problems down the road, because you're not going to be able to serve your child the best you can, which is what everybody wants. My slogan is that I believe in mandatory screening for dyslexia in everybody from kindergarten to 2nd grade in public schools in all 50 states. And I think until that happens, we're not going to change the trajectory of special ed in America, because we're going to keep trying to serve kids who have dyslexia in special ed instead of buying different software and publications for these other kids to do in the general classroom.
I just want to say I love your story about your IEP meeting and you got services for your daughter. It really shows how powerful making some noise and getting an advocate can be. You are a great example of dedication to helping your daughter and getting her everything that she needs. Thank you for sharing your story with us.
Yeah, thank you. And I have a group called the Dyslexia Life, which I do out of the kindness of my heart. So if anybody who watches your video wants help, I'm happy to try to help anyone who is serious about doing what I tell them to do for free. They just need to ask and be committed to actually doing what I say. But if you are willing to do something and listen to what I'm saying, I'm happy to help anybody who asks me for help.
And that is no joke. Hilary has spent hours helping people for free. And she's even helped me with a parent concern letter. She's very knowledgeable, and her background in paralegal allows her to write things legally and navigate the laws. And I would definitely recommend going to Hilary if you have any questions. That's it for today's video. Thanks again, Hilary, and everybody who's watching. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe. Let me know if you'd like to share your story. You can contact me in the comments or with direct messages. We'll see you next time.